Hi, everybody. Welcome to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeffrey Rosen, the president of this wonderful institution, which has some Scottish music fetchingly accompanying us in the background. And Scottish music is appropriate because we are about to talk about, I was going to do a segue to the history of the Scottish Enlightenment, to Jefferson, to Lincoln, but in fact there's no need for this strained intellectual arabesque. What we have to do now is recite our congressional motto, which is to disseminate information about the US Constitution on a non-partisan basis. Excellent. And in these polarized times, during this momentous presidential election, there's a great need for historical understanding. We need to educate ourselves about where the current philosophical divisions came from, what the similarities are, and what the differences are. And there is no better way to do that than to hear from two of America's greatest intellectual historians who have written books that are uniquely relevant to our current vexations. It is an extraordinary honor to welcome my old friends and these great scholars, Sidney Blumenthal and Sean Wilentz. Sid Blumenthal is former assistant and senior advisor to President Bill Clinton and senior advisor to Hillary Clinton. I came to know him when we worked together at the New Republic. He's worked for the New Yorker, the Washington Post, and elsewhere. His phenomenal books include the best-selling The Clinton Wars, The Rise of the Counter-Establishment, The Permanent Campaign, and his superb book, which we will discuss today, The Political Life of Abraham Lincoln, a Self-Made Man, the first of 3 volumes devoted to Abraham Lincoln. It's an extraordinary achievement and whets our appetite for more. And Sean Wilentz is the George Henry Davis 1886 Professor of American History at Princeton University, the author of the Bancroft Prize-winning The Rise of American Democracy, Bob Dylan in America, and his latest book, The Politicians and the Egalitarians, The Hidden History of American Politics. I've been looking forward to this conversation for months. We're about to have it. Please welcome Sid Blumenthal and Sean Wilentz. Wow, we have a lot to talk about. Let us jump right in. Sean, the thesis of this extraordinary book, which really, I don't know if it continues or resurrects a tradition of intellectual history that's written for citizens to help us set our philosophical debates in context, and is so powerful in that way. You say that there have been 2 strains that have been consistent in American politics, a devotion to party politics and a devotion to anti-monopoly, egalitarianism, and economic equality. Let's begin with that second theme. Tell us about the anti-monopoly egalitarian strain and how it was introduced and how it's played out.
Well, going back to the very beginnings of the Republic, there was always a suspicion, or a fear rather, that great disparities of wealth were going to be bad for a republic or for a democracy. That necessarily, the wider that disparity became, the more power would flow to the top and people at the bottom would be left out. And you see that across the board during the early republic. You see it in Thomas Jefferson, you actually see it in John Adams, you see it across the board. Not everybody believed all of that. Some thought that inequality was good to foster economic growth, greatness, etc. But that fear was always there. And it's continued. It's been a perennial in our politics. It's something like a subterranean river. I mean, sometimes it comes up to the surface, sometimes it plunges below, but it's always been there. You even see it during the Civil War era, where the slavocracy was thought of as a small, tiny elite that had too much power. Again, the egalitarian tradition asserted itself.
Great. And then the second tradition that you say has been central to American politics and is a key to unlocking the secrets of American political history is the fact that partisanship is a permanent fixture in America. This is in many ways a case for partisanship. Why is that?
Well, it's almost inevitable. The framers designed a constitution which was against parties. The framers, people here in this building and across the street, believed that if you had political parties, they were going to fractionalize, they were going to dissolve public unanimity. Better to have politics run by the gentlemen of property and standing, and they would decide everything, liberality and light. But very early on in the 1790s, there are too many clashing interests in America for that to work out very well. So very early on, an opposition gathered around Thomas Jefferson and James Madison to oppose the administration on issues about banks and foreign policy. Those are the first parties that arose, the Federalist Party and the Democratic Republican Party. And the two of them arose, and we've had political parties ever since. And ever since then, political parties have been the vehicles for the egalitarian tradition that I talk about. These days, historians tend to think of political parties as citizens, in fact. These days, parties are thought of as inhibitors of democracy. They get in the way of democratic possibilities. When in fact, throughout American history, it's been precisely the opposite, that political parties have been the main vehicles for the egalitarian tradition.
You talk, Sid, I'm setting the stage, and then we're going to dig into Lincoln. Just one or two more beats. You've given examples of major party crack-ups, and you had a great New York Times piece where you talked about the election of 1880, of 1850, the progressive era with Roosevelt, and then the crack-up in the 60s of the Republican Party.
Right.
Broadly, does the party that can tap into this egalitarian tradition have the best chance of being a national majority?
Well, not necessarily. Parties are coalitions. Parties are never static. Parties are never all one thing. So there are always interests within them. They may divide against each other, but within them there are various interests. And from time to time, those interests will fall apart. So that in the 1850s, for example, both parties had very different ideas about the economy and so forth, but they agreed to keep the slavery issue out of politics. Well, when the slavery issue became ineluctable, became irreversible, then the parties fell apart. So that parties are not, permanent in any particular way. They're going to reassemble, re-emerge. The parties of egalitarianism, though, however, in the 1790s, in the 1850s, again in the 1930s, it was very much the party that managed to get a hold of this swell of discontent about egalitarianism that managed to establish long-term political orders, so that the Democratic Republicans came in, and they lasted for a very long time. The Republican Party, after the Civil War, lasted a very long time. Its hegemony, its dominance. The New Deal, we all know about the New Deal because there are enough gray heads in here who agree with me about this. Understand that, lasted a long time. It's been a while. And then in the 60s as well, although that was undone by the Vietnam War. But yes, I do think that that's right, that the upswell tends to help the party that manages to tap into that and to secure it usually does manage to establish itself for a very long time.
Okay, well, of course, we'll talk about what the past can tell us about the present later, but let's use 1850 and Lincoln as a case study. Sid, these two books complement each other so rivetingly because you make a case for Lincoln as a practical, partisan, effective politician, and then talk about him tapping into this egalitarian tradition. Maybe set the stage by telling us how we moved from a world of the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans of the founding era to the Whigs cracking up and becoming the Republicans versus Democrats, and what role did Lincoln talk about Lincoln's personal evolution as he struggled with this philosophical crack-up?
Well, this book deals with Lincoln, who is an impoverished, stunted, and he feels oppressed boy who calls himself a slave to his father, among other people, because his father took his wages until he was 21. His father was himself an oppressed man who fled from Kentucky, where he had to compete for wages against slaves, to the free state of Indiana. He was a semi-literate dirt farmer who also suppressed his son's reading, which he considered to be a form of laziness, and beat him for reading. Lincoln emerges and leaves his family. He's a man without a family, and he finds his way to this river town called New Salem, Illinois, in central Illinois, and almost immediately attaches himself to political people and rises continually from the age of 23 on as a new man in America. And what is that new man? That man is, we know he's a lawyer, but he became a lawyer because he was a politician. He was brought up in every phase of politics. He was of the first generation of professional party politicians in America. And that party was a new party. It was the Whig Party. It was organized around Henry Clay's program called the American System to establish infrastructure for the United States to project itself both commercially and its sense of destiny across this vast continent. It was not anti-government, it was pro-government, believed in a very positive role for government in that. And it also believed in rising men, in opportunity for men like Lincoln. And it believed in free labor. That party that Lincoln grew up in which he became a stalwart member, and I document every phase of his political development in life here until he enters the political wilderness after his one term in Congress. And he goes back to Central Illinois. He's grappling already as a congressman with the issues that he will face in the Civil War that are brought about by the Mexican War, the taking of the Western territories and whether they'll be free or slave, and whether that slavery should be limited. He tries to limit it. He comes back, he's in the wilderness, he has no future, he doesn't know what's going to happen to him. And in the 1850s, the Whig Party, which was believed to be one of the permanent parties of the United States, completely cracks up over the issue of slavery. Lincoln's great rival, Stephen A. Douglas, sponsors the Kansas-Nebraska Act, opening up those territories to whether or not they will be free or slave based on what the settlers decide. So there's a scramble among the settlers, and we get bleeding Kansas. They start killing each other on each side. The Whig Party divides into southern and northern wings, splits apart, and at the same time, it breaks apart over immigration. Because there's a huge wave of immigration after 1848 in the United States as a result of the Irish potato famine and the failed revolution in Europe, which leads to Germans coming over. So we get a huge wave of Irish and Germans here, and a large part of the Whigs especially regard these immigrants as a danger to the very character of the nation because they are so different and they also have a different religion, the Irish especially. And the first principle of this anti-immigrant movement is that only native-born Protestants should hold public office in the United States. Pennsylvania was a real stronghold of this movement. They were called the Know-Nothings, and they'd formed a political party called the American Party. Many of them were old Whigs. Many of them Lincoln knew well. They elected a governor of Illinois who was somebody who had been an ally of Lincoln and who later allied with Lincoln. And Lincoln understood that he had to crack up this anti-immigrant movement in order to create a broad anti-slavery coalition that could be the basis of what was emerging as the new Republican Party, create a new party based on this issue of anti-slavery, which would also be a movement for opportunity and free labor, and a movement for democracy against the slave power. So Lincoln eventually, this party, we can go on in great detail, was formed state by state, the Republican Party, what we call the Party of Lincoln today. And the Party of Lincoln was the party that Lincoln formed in the state of Illinois. And he was centrally involved. Abolitionists in Illinois who knew him for years were desperate for, and this goes to Sean's theme of the relationship between the egalitarians and the politicians, were desperate for Lincoln as the political leader to help form this new party. They knew they couldn't do it on their own. They were radical abolitionists. They were stigmatized politically, and they required someone with political skills, the kind of skills that Lincoln had gained through a lifetime by that point, to create this party, someone who knew how to do this. And there were people in the abolitionist movement who understood that and saw in Lincoln the key figure. And Lincoln did form that. And I will just, I could go on, but I'll just tell you about the key meeting that takes place. It's a meeting that in Decatur, Illinois, of editors of local newspapers, and they've called a conference. And it's on February 22nd, 1856. And it's Washington's birthday. It's the same day that the first national conference of the Republican Party is meeting in Pittsburgh. So they're meeting in Illinois, and the editors are very political, and they want to form the Republican Party in Illinois. Lincoln is brought there. The meeting almost breaks up over an issue, and the issue is immigration. And some of the people there are nativists and are anti-immigrant. George Schneider, who's the editor of the leading German abolitionist newspaper in Chicago, the Staatszeitung, is a member of this group. And he says, and he proposes a resolution that is in favor of immigrants having rights. And they're deadlocked. And Schneider says, I'm going to let Lincoln resolve this. And they agree, because they brought Lincoln in for this purpose. And Lincoln says, there's not an argument here. He says, this resolution is based on the principles of the Declaration of Independence. So we don't have an argument now. And so they all agreed to this resolution. And as a result of that, the Illinois Republican Party was created. And because of Lincoln's intervention. And it shows the role and the tension between egalitarians and politicians and how Lincoln played this out.
Beautifully said. The audience is resonating to the immigration and slavery split up. Sean, give us you talk about the crucial 1850s split up of the Whigs over anti-slavery and immigration as well. Describe that split and what were the positions that emerged, and then describe Lincoln's choices about slavery and preserving the Union and how he redefined the Republican Party accordingly.
Well, there were these two great issues that were emerging in the 1850s. Slavery had been spreading. The Kansas-Nebraska Act was passed, signed. But at the same time, the largest percentage of the population as immigrants arrived in America, in all of American history, Irish and German. So these are the two crises facing the country at the time. And when the Whig Party fell apart over slavery, there were many who thought, well, the real issue, the most important issue, is immigration, or the nativists. They wanted to not only make sure that all office holders would be native-born, they also wanted to extend naturalization, so you have to live in the country for 21 years before you could become an American citizen. They basically wanted to take political power completely away from anyone who had immigrated from abroad. There was this fight then. Which way are we going to go? Is it going to be one or the other? And there were some people who were in both camps, who were both anti-slavery and anti-immigration. It took people at the core of the emerging Republican Party to decide which way is it going to go. And Lincoln, among others, pushed it towards anti-slavery, marginalized. Lincoln has a very famous quotation where he says, how can I be, anti-immigrant? We start off in this country, if we have the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. Then we say, well, maybe blacks are less equal than whites, and maybe Catholics are less equal than someone, and then eventually we'll be in a despotism. He saw immigration and slavery, but slavery was the issue that was really, so that therefore nativism was just as bad as pro-slavery. He saw them as together. So the Republican Party could only stand for the Declaration of Independence, and it was Lincoln and the Republicans, the anti-slavery Republicans, who prevailed, in state by state, as Sidney said, state by state by state. The American Party actually ran a candidate in 1856, a former Whig named Millard Fillmore, against the Republican, John C. Fremont, and then in 1856, James Buchanan from Pennsylvania. And they ran, and that was the high point, and then very quickly the downfall of the American Party, and the Republican Party emerged as the great opposition.
Sid, Sean says that historians who claim that Lincoln recreated the Constitution at Gettysburg and fulfilled the promise of the Declaration of Independence in the Gettysburg Address are reading it out of context. In fact, the Declaration was central to the Republican platform from the beginning. Talk about, Lincoln is obviously struggling to reconcile. He famously said, as Sean also notes, and you do, if I could preserve the Union and free the slaves, I'd do that. If I could preserve the Union and not free them, I'd do that. How committed was he to freeing the slaves, and describe the evolution and his balance between these two twin goals of preserving the Union and freeing the slaves?
Lincoln said in one of his two brief autobiographies, which were he dictated for campaign purposes, I am naturally anti-slavery. What he means by that is that he was born to be anti-slavery, that it's in his DNA because of his family. And very few people understand what that meant, and he never explained. Lincoln was remarkably reticent about talking about his own origins, although eventually it was promoted that he was the rail splitter and, you know, lived in a log cabin and came from humble origins. He didn't like to talk about it. He felt humiliated by his background. But he was anti-slavery almost by birth. His parents, who were these semi-literate people living in Kentucky, belonged to what were called emancipationist churches, of primitive Baptist churches. They were very unusual churches of that day, and they always belonged to those. So he always had this anti-slavery feeling. His father fled Kentucky because of slavery. Lincoln always said, slave states are states poor white people must remove from, not states to go to. He develops over time into the politics of anti-slavery, which is a long history. But when he was in the Illinois legislature and a very young man in his 20s, he's only one of two legislators who is against slavery. Illinois was the most racist northern state, largely populated by these people from Kentucky who had escaped from slavery and had created what's called a black code to prevent free blacks from coming in the state. They were forbidden from coming in the state. Lincoln, as a state legislator, proposed a bill for emancipation in the District of Columbia, the early cause of the abolitionists. He was not an abolitionist. He never thought of himself that way, but he would talk to them, and eventually he allied himself with them. And when he formed the party and went to that meeting I described, he told his law partner, William Herndon, tell them I'll be there, radicals and all. Lincoln's we're in the Constitution Center. Constitutional thinking, in terms of slavery, has many sources. One of the sources is the Ordinance of 1787, which created the Northwest Territory, including the state of Illinois, which he would come to represent, and where he would live out his, early political life before the presidency. And he that ordinance, which is one of the first acts that was passed by the first Congress, and was considered by Lincoln to be as valued as the Constitution itself. It barred slavery in that territory. It was inspired by Thomas Jefferson, who was a slave owner and yet was also in his own way opposed to slavery in many ways. The constitutional thinking, and Sean has gone into the scholarship of this at great length, develops over whether or not the Constitution itself is a pro or anti-slavery document. And anti-slavery people and abolitionists developed the idea that it is an anti-slavery document and that slavery does not exist in the Constitution. We know that there is the 3/5 of a man provision for voting and so on. And there are a number of others, but the word slavery is never mentioned. So Salmon P. Chase of Ohio, who becomes a very important figure for Lincoln, who becomes a senator and becomes his Secretary of the Treasury, early on develops this idea for the Liberty Party, the first anti-slavery political party that precedes the emergence of the Republican Party. Lincoln draws on all these strands, the ordinance, which contains the language that the people there should be henceforth and forever free. That language shows up in the Emancipation Proclamation from the Ordinance of 1787. And then, of course, the Declaration of Independence, which is the touchstone, the foundation of his politics. And there is a debate that takes place in the 1850s in which senators speak on the floor of the Senate and call the Declaration of Independence a self-evident lie. And Lincoln is enraged by this. And he believes that the Declaration informs his understanding of the Constitution and what must be done on this burning question.
Sean, more on Lincoln's constitutional vision. As Sid said, the Declaration was a touchstone. He stood on the steps of Independence Hall on July 4th, 1861, and said, "I would rather be assassinated on this spot than abandon the principles of the Declaration." Talk about how Lincoln blended aspects of Hamilton and Jefferson and redefined the Constitution and the sources of his constitutional vision.
Well, I mean, from the very beginning, not only Lincoln, but the entire anti-slavery movement believed that organic law in America began with the Declaration of Independence. The Declaration of Independence and the Constitution were the two founding documents. They were not contradictory. They were perfectly in line with each other. So that when the Declaration of Independence said, we hold these truths but seven, that all men are created equal, that pertained to the Constitution as well. The question came, well, what about slavery in the Constitution? Because after all, there are these provisions in the Constitution, these compromises over the 3/5 Clause, the Fugitive Slave Clause, the Atlantic slave trade, that seem to enshrine slavery by sort of subterfuge in the Constitution. Lincoln said no, and the anti-slavery forces said no. That the Constitution itself, in fact, not only did not include the word slavery, but by refusing to recognize the status of human beings as property in man, by refusing to do that, which the Southern delegates of the convention very much wanted to do, by refusing to do that was putting slavery eventually on the road to extinction. And that is very much what Lincoln believed, that the framers did not enshrine slavery in the Constitution. This was not to be a slaveholders' republic. It was to be a republic that had to recognize the existence of slavery to survive in 1787, couldn't have done so without it, but did not say that this would be a pillar of the new republic. Basically, what Lincoln is saying in the 1850s is he's cashing in effect, that check, that promissory note that was there, as Martin Luther King later put it, the promissory note of freedom that was there. Frederick Douglass said that the Constitution of the United States leans toward freedom. That was what Lincoln believed as well. The slaveholders, of course, thought that slavery very much was a constitutional provision, and that's why they seceded when Lincoln was elected. But note that Lincoln understood. Lincoln said, look, the Constitution does not permit the federal government to interfere with slavery where it already exists. That much was true. But that did not mean that the federal government was powerless against slavery. It could keep slavery out of the territories, for example. It could legislate over slavery in the District of Columbia. It could legislate over slavery in the high seas. Lincoln saw the possibilities of ending slavery by using all the federal power that was possible to constrict slavery, to keep it well-bounded and eventually to strangle it to death. That was the idea. And that was very much what the Republican Party was about in the 1860 election. That was why the slaveholders seceded. It was a way to get rid of slavery under the Constitution. He saw himself as fulfilling what the Founding Fathers really, truly wanted. And that was to strangle slavery, but within constitutional means. The slaveholders would not have it, and the Civil War came.
If I can just
add, let me just tee up an extra beat as you respond to that. Sean's book argues that partisanship and being a master politician is crucial to political success. You argue that contrary to stereotypes of Lincoln as a philosopher, he was also a master politician. How did his masterful political skills allow him to reconcile the philosophical divides that Sean has just set up and that you're about to amplify?
Lincoln became a master politician. The idea that there was Lincoln the politician and Lincoln the great emancipator, and that somehow they were separate, is a false idea. They were the same man, and he became the great emancipator precisely because he was the great politician. And he was able to do this. We saw in the movie Lincoln a little bit about that, of what happened in the passage of the 13th Amendment abolishing slavery. And all of that is true. What appears in the movie of Lincoln and Seward working behind the scenes and pulling strings and even paying money and offering patronage and getting that passed. So what began as what was called the small arts of politics turned into the greatest act in American history. And Lincoln learns this step by step by step, day by day by day, from becoming the surrogate son in New Salem to the justice of the peace, a man named Bowling Green, who's the doorkeeper in the state legislature. From learning all this, from all the way up to becoming the protege of the Whig floor leader in the Illinois legislature, from becoming somebody known as a slasher on debate stages against opponents as a young man and sent out by his party to take down opponents.
Give an example. How was he a slasher?
He would appear on debates with older men, and he was faster, quicker, and than
Don't
they
take
were.
it personally, guys. No.
He was the young Ali on the debate stage, and he would humiliate them as somehow having sold out, compromised. And at one point early on, one of his early letters, he says, he attacks a proposal. He says, this is done by politicians. And then he says, well, being a politician, I know what I'm talking about.
Those stinking politicians, right?
Yeah.
Right.
But two constitutional points here, just to add to what Sean said on this question of slavery. Lincoln believed that he was extending the Ordinance of 1787 in prohibiting slavery from territories to the West. And that was crucial in preventing the extension of slavery, which becomes the great issue that leads to the Civil War. And then there's the question of how do you have emancipation constitutionally? This perplexed Lincoln. What happens during his transition is that Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts arrives and says, well, I happen to have the answer to this question early on. And I have a whole chapter on John Quincy Adams in here. John Quincy Adams is the one who figures out that the war powers of the president can be used to emancipate the slaves. It is under a war situation that the president would have these special powers. And the Civil War was such a war. Lincoln, in issuing the Emancipation Proclamation, relies upon the war powers of the president. For him, that's not good enough. He has to put it in the Constitution. And he has to put it there because he believes it's right for it to be in the Constitution and has to be protected as law, but also politically. It can be undone if it's just a proclamation. So his politics are deeply informed by his understanding of the Constitution.
More on the Constitution. Sean, this anti-monopoly tradition, which you trace up from Jefferson to John Quincy Adams to Lincoln, Theodore Roosevelt, and Wilson, FDR, takes a hiatus until from the New Deal through the recent era, and then is re-picked up again after the crash of 2008. Why did the anti-monopoly tradition get co-opted by the conservative Supreme Court to strike down maximum hour and minimum wage laws, and why, as a liberal constitutional principle in the Louis Brandeis tradition, didn't we hear more of it in the 20th century?
Yeah. Well, there was a big switch. I mean, going back to the beginning, the idea was, the American Revolution was fought over the idea that if you had too close a relationship between private interests and the state, that somehow liberty was being denied. That was what the American Revolution was sort of fought over, right? No taxation without representation, et cetera. And that idea runs throughout the Jeffersonian, Jacksonian tradition. Remember, the Bank of the United States, another big building here in Philadelphia, the second bank in the United States, which was founded, the second bank was founded in 1816, was thought of as an unconstitutional mingling of public power and private power. The bank was a private bank, yet it had a large, it was basically the Treasury of the United States. It had all of the money there, that private bankers had their hands on the levers of power that was illicit, unconstitutional. Or so Andrew Jackson said. And Andrew Jackson went about effectively destroying the second bank of the United States. That was part of the anti-monopoly tradition. The idea was that too close a relationship, I guess we call it crony capitalism today or something like that, that too close a relationship was a bad idea. And the state, the idea was to make the state as small as possible, to keep the state out of those kinds of relationships, and freedom would ensue. Free market, Adam Smith, all of that. Things began to change at the end of the 19th century, when in fact the state corporations were so powerful, they were more powerful than the state. And the state's role became one of regulating those monopolies. So it was no longer a matter of separating the state and private power. It was using the state to try and curb the excesses of private power, of corporate power. And that's where the anti-monopoly tradition really takes on its new formation, which is not again, it's using the state rather than restricting the state. And so Brandeis and that entire progressive tradition comes out of that basic change that occurs. You can see it happening somewhere between 1880 and about 1900. And that's the great tradition. Now, what has happened since then is that the question of antitrust and all the things that Brandeis was talking about really has fallen by the wayside over the last, well, you can take it back certainly to the 1970s and 1980s. And you know, it's time to be looking seriously at that all again, it seems to me.
Sid, Sean talks about the progressives like Theodore Roosevelt using, as Herbert Croly famously said, Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends. In other words, having big regulatory bodies to constrain the banks. Have progressives lost the anti-monopoly tradition to their discredit? And why have we heard about it in this election only from the Sanders camp? And given its incredible resonance throughout American history, how could it be resurrected?
Well, I recall during the Clinton presidency that there were suits filed against the tobacco companies and also against Microsoft. And there was a very large antitrust suit filed against Microsoft. There's been less antitrust action in recent years, and I imagine that it may well be picked up if there's another Democratic administration. And I think that many of the practical, innovative ideas that Louis Brandeis had, versions of those, I think there'd be a receptivity to them in the future, such as profit sharing. Hillary Clinton's already advanced a profit sharing proposal. I think there are all kinds of just ideas that don't fit the usual pattern of being either pro or anti-business, that are a different way of approaching these issues in terms of practical policies.
Sean, in the book you talk about how in the 1960s in the Great Society, progressives and liberals became more interested in extending racial and gender equality to unrepresented groups and less focused on this anti-monopoly tradition. How did that happen, and how can the two traditions coexist today?
Well, I think what happened was in the 1960s there was this great convergence of the politicians and the egalitarians, the title of the book. The most important word in that title, it's actually not a word, it's an ampersand. It's the politicians and the egalitarians. And in the 1960s, it was one of those moments when the two converged, and it was really quite extraordinary. Lyndon Johnson coming out of, with his great hero FDR, coming out of the New Deal, seeing himself very much as a New Deal, Southern New Dealer, but a New Dealer, picked up, combined with the Civil Rights Movement, and he embraced the Civil Rights Movement. And what you saw there was an extraordinary convergence in American history, one of the most extraordinary, I think, where a Southern New Deal president who wanted to bring the Great Society, wanted to abolish poverty in America, was linking his own, and he said this in 1965, "We shall overcome," linking his presidency, linking his government to the cause of civil rights. That was an extraordinary convergence. And had history taken a different turn, we'd be in a very different place than we are now. The tragedies of the 1960s, I don't have to remind the audience too much of, but between the reaction to the civil rights steps that Johnson took, the Voting Rights Act, especially in 1965, and the Vietnam War, that moment came to an end. And when that moment came to an end in 1968, well, it sort of predates the politics we're in now. The backlash that was whipped up against civil rights, the social issues, all the rest of it, you can see the continuum quite clearly, I think, undid that moment. And we've been really living in the shadow of that moment ever since, in fundamental ways. So lost in all of that was not simply a reaction against civil rights, and I think that there was a feeling that you had to protect that if at all possible. But also lost out of that was something of the New Deal. Now, times have changed. New Deal ideas are not, New Deal programs are not necessarily applicable today, although they can be updated and they can be redone, and the Clinton administration actually tried to do some of that. But there's been a disconnection, and that disconnection has continued to haunt our politics. And in effect, we're getting right back to that, I think, this year, in very, very important ways.
Well, let's talk
Not
about...
to introduce this year too quickly.
Well, let's talk about this year because
Right.
the audience questions, and I have to say, your questions are always better than mine, and thank you for them. And let's just jump right into them because they're excellent. A lot of people want to know about this year. One questioner asks, Sid, lessons for today's Republicans in the demise of the Whigs and rise of the Republican. This is from Neil Kaufman, Brandeis 69, so congratulations
You're here.
for that. But Sid, cast this historically. What?
These are friends. These are friends, these two.
Beautiful. Great question. Great university. Great namesake. What lessons for today's Republicans from the demise of the Whig and the rise of the Republicans back then?
Well, I hear Republicans talking about the party of Lincoln today, and in the face of in the time of Trump, and and you can see the dilemma that they faced in the last week when Paul Ryan, the Speaker of the House, gave a desultory endorsement of Donald Trump and then denounced him for his comments about the judge in the Trump University case who is of Mexican origin. And Trump said he couldn't get a fair shake from this judge because he's Mexican. Then went on to say just yesterday that he couldn't get a fair shake from a hypothetical, non-existent judge who might be Muslim. And more Republicans stepped out who made these comments. But they're stuck now with this nominee, and they have made a decision to endorse him. Very few have not endorsed him. And as a political matter, they have to either offend those who are pro-Trump or those who are anti-Trump. And I think they feel that they are in a vice politically.
Sean, our guest asks, it's a great historian, what would you write about the 2016 election and the Democratic and Republican parties? You say in the book that Trump is unlike a candidate or in your op-ed, unlike a candidate we've had before.
Well, he's never had a reality TV show run for president. So in that sense, he's very, very new.
Cast it historically.
We've seen party crack-ups before, and I think the Republican Party is paying the price for 40 years of radicalizing its base, somewhat cynically radicalizing its base, and its base finally said, well, a Democrat once said to me, the suckers wised up. And they got tired of a leadership that was promising to end modern life as we know it. And they finally said, well, we're not going to have you anymore. So Donald Trump comes along saying, we're going to make America great again, and they swarm to him. So in that sense, the Republican Party is in a state of crisis. They're in the vice they're in, but there's a larger crisis. Because if Trump wins, then the Republican Party is unlike any species of party we've ever seen before. And if he loses, there'll be an enormous struggle for power among the various factions that are still there. But regardless of Trump, and this is important, I think, and it goes back to what we were talking about before, Jeff, about the 60s and now. No matter what happens in this election, no matter who the nominees would have been, this was looming to be a crossroads election. A crossroads election, the most important in our lifetimes, and we're all pretty old, right? No. Ma'am, with one beautiful exception. With one beautiful exception. I'm sorry. I apologize. But the rest of us, we remember all that old stuff. Look, if the Republican nominee had won, no matter who it was, could have been John Kasich, wouldn't have mattered. The Republican Party would have control of every level of government in the United States. State houses, governorships, the majority, all three branches of the federal government. Extraordinary. One party, and a party that had moved very, very far to the right. I mean, if John Kasich is the moderate in that party, then we have a very, very right-wing party. So imagine that. That's one result, just for the election of the president. A Democrat wins, no matter who it was. There's a pretty good possibility that the Senate, therefore, would become Democratic. With the passing of Justice Scalia in particular now, the Supreme Court would become much more liberal than it's been for the last 30 years. And so you'd have the Senate, the White House, and a Supreme Court, which has been the pillar of this conservative regime, a pillar of that regime. Two very, very different outcomes. Going back to Abraham Lincoln famously said in 1858 that the nation stood as a house divided over slavery, that the country was going to become all one thing or all the other. The 2016 election it's not the Civil War, but the Civil War sets a very high standard for political crises. You don't have to be the Civil War to have things be pretty bad, okay? We are at that kind of crossroads in American political life today, I firmly believe. We're going to become one thing or another. People talk about gridlock in Washington. And are we in a permanent state of gridlock? We are not in a permanent state. America's never in a permanent state of gridlock. It's not the structure. It's one party that's been obstructing for a very long time. The gridlock's going to be decided. One side's going to win or the other side's going to win. That's what this election's about, I think. Very much so.
Sid, back to the 1850s, several of our on a nonpartisan basis.
Not to put too much of a damper on the conversation.
No, it's the light that the past can cast on the present that allows us to continue to fulfill our congressional mandate so elegantly. How prevalent was illegal immigration in the 1850s and on until the present? When did the distinction between legal and immigration arise, and how did it become central? Let me just throw out another 1850s question, because there are two. And then what were the compelling events which motivated voters to break with the Whig Party and form the Republican Party? Does the financial structure of the GOP now make it harder to splinter? Those are related questions.
I see. Well, there was no illegal immigration then. You could just come into the country, and people came in.
There was naturalization, which was the equivalent, I suppose.
Yeah, but you could come in, and it depended where you lived, but often, even despite naturalization laws, if you came in, you could vote too.
Yeah, pretty much so.
You could just show
Especially
up
in New
right
York,
away.
Philadelphia, Chicago.
And there were, and the Whigs, didn't like the Irish showing up right away and voting in huge numbers where they could be a swing vote and so on, and they turned nativist. And then the Germans initially aligned with the Democrats. They were all liberals who left Germany, and they thought, Democratic Party. And then when the slavery issue became inflamed, they all switched and were an essential element in the creation of the Republican Party. Really, not until the immigration bill of the early 1920s was there such an issue as illegal immigration in the United States.
There's a Chinese exclusion in the 1880s, but then 1924.
Yeah. So,
John, do you want to take a beat on the nativism debates of the 20s and how that fit into the Republican Democratic
Well, I mean, yeah.
alignment?
Coming out of World War I, there's a great conservative reaction, and nativism has been a part of that. And anti-Catholicism and nativism, the two often track together. So that in 1924, the high point of the Coolidge-Harding era, there was a great deal of anti-immigrant feeling. Remember, during World War I, there had been the anti-German feeling that had to do with the war, but it swept. And the idea was, going back for some time, really going back to the 1880s, that America was awash in all of these Southern and Central Europeans, all of these dark Italians and Slovaks and so forth, and it had to be halted. And in the 1920s, it finally hit its political peak, and the 1924 Immigrant Exclusion Act basically said that the proportion of people from certain ethnic groups that currently existed in America would be the quotient from then on in, which basically cut off Eastern and Central European immigration. If you were of Anglo-Saxon, you could come in. And then Asian completely cut off in 1924.
Sid, why have we not had one of the major parties embracing anti-immigration sentiment since the 20s, unless I'm missing an important election? And how does that play out now that the election has become more multicultural, now that it's being resurrected today?
well, back to the 60s, one of the great New Frontier Great Society landmarks was the passage of new immigration policies, pioneered by President Kennedy and then signed by President Johnson, which ended these discriminatory exclusions of Eastern, Central, and Southern Europeans, and also Latin Americans.
And Asians.
And Asians. And that is the basis of the new waves of immigration that have come in since 1965. And that bill was passed. And that bill was intended to override the early bills from the early policy from the 20s. So now we're seeing the reaction to that.
In some ways, what we're seeing is the long-term reaction to the 65 Act. It's the last, well, it's been there all along, but insofar as the last political era has been a reaction against the Great Society, this is part of all of that.
So we talk about the reaction against the 60s. This is part of the reaction against the 60s. We just don't think of it that way because we don't locate it in the policy, but that's what it was.
To both of you, I'm so eager for your thoughts on this question. I've learned from both of your books that in the past, populist movements have tended to be rooted in claims about the Constitution, from the People's Party to Lincoln and the Republicans to the original Federalist and Republican Democratic parties. They've been based on claims about the Constitution's meaning. Today, the populist forces that we're seeing from supporters of both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders are not centrally making claims about the Constitution, and some indeed have criticized forces on both the left and the right for being anti-constitutional. Why is that?
It's a good question.
Yeah, that's a
I mean,
great
Trump,
question.
in fact, is talking about getting rid of the 14th Amendment, if I'm not mistaken, about birthright citizenship. So if anything, it's an anti-constitutional movement.
He's also talked about the First Amendment as well, in two parts, one about religion and excluding an entire religion from entering the country, and two, on the freedom of the press. He wants new laws to inhibit freedom of the press.
I know Adam Liptak had a piece yesterday quoting libertarian and conservative scholars criticizing both Trump and Sanders, but in particular Trump, for being anti-constitutionalist. Sean, we got 2 minutes. I want the answer to this question.
I don't know
It's really important to me to know the answer.
Well, there's a way in which, you know, on both sides, coming out of the history that I talk about in this book, there is a main political tradition that you can see egalitarianism and party politics working themselves out, always grounded in the Constitution. The Constitution is the basis for understanding all those, going way back to the beginning. Why has it come unhooked now? I don't know the answer. Maybe Sid does. I really don't. You got me stumped. I know.
If you don't know the answer,
it's
who
so
does?
unusual.
No,
Part of the answer has to do with the contemporary Republican politics and the conservative movement attached itself to certain constitutional ideas. They're very elaborate, originalism,
right.
And some of them are populist, like the Tea Party, where they dress up as reenactors of the Tea Party and the American Revolutionaries and so on. That part of the Republican Party was defeated by Donald Trump in the primaries. Trump defeated the old Republican Guard, represented by Jeb Bush, and he also defeated the conservative movement that has grown up since Barry Goldwater, and to quite a formidable institutional presence within the party, and has sometimes seemed to take it over. And he defeated that in the person of Ted Cruz. So he's defeated all of this, and he stands on top of this, and he has no constitutional ideas except on the limiting certain aspects of the Bill of Rights right now. Those are his only constitutional ideas.
He doesn't come out of politics. And insofar as politics are grounded in the Constitution, it's not there.
Well, is that part of the answer? Because to keep things bipartisan, Sanders, too, has not been making constitutional claims, and in fact has attributed his proposal to break up the banks to Theodore Roosevelt, when actually it was Wilson. So is the idea that both of these candidates who are not rooted to political parties but are more the politics of personality makes it less likely for them to be making their arguments in constitutional terms?
That sounds good to me.
High praise. Well, it's exactly 1 o'clock. That's not a bad place to end. Please join me in thanking Sidney Blumenthal and John Wilentz. These great historians will be signing books outside. Please buy these wonderful books, and thank you all.
Great.
My classmate is down there.
I gather.
I gotta go see him.
Go. Sure.